Hi, CW3 Rob Wood here, going over instrument planning. We're going to look to see if we're going to need an alternate to do our flight today. How do we do that? How do we utilize the numbers to determine that? Well, there's requirements in 95.1 that state if you're going to need an alternate. And there's also requirements stating what you need to have in order to use an airfield as an alternate. So alternate airfield selection. First requirement would be to know if radar is required. You'll look on your approach plate and it'll tell you if radar is required. Sometimes they'll say radar or, and if you have the other piece of equipment for or, then radar is not required for the approach to be flown. Also, you have make sure that nav aids are monitored. You could find this in your IFR supplement, and then you're going to augment that with NOTAMs. So the IFR supplement is going to tell you if something's monitored or unmonitored, and then the NOTAMs are going to tell you anything that is out of the ordinary for what the IFR supplement says on nav aids being monitored. Then we come to 401 above weather planning minimums, predominant weather applied. How do we get this number? Well, we're going to look on our approach plate. It's going to be the number at the bottom in the parentheses. Let me find one here for you. We will go to try Wheeler Army. At the bottom of the approach plate, you'll have weather planning minimums in parentheses, 501. This is for Wheeler to do a VOR. Since weather planning minimums are in parentheses, easy to identify, you take that, and we're going to be 401 above that. Luckily, we're copters, though. Copters, we can reduce our Category A visibility by half, but no less than a quarter. So we'll do that. That way we could get out of the airfield. If weather's too bad, we want to have the best case scenario for weather to know if we could use this airfield and not need an alternate. So we reduce it by half. How do we do that? We take our Category A weather planning minimums, 501. We can reduce it, the visibility, by half, no less than a quarter. So we take that 1 mile visibility and make it a half a mile visibility. Then we apply our 401 above that weather planning minimum. That would give us 901.5. If we could try it again, if we go to Honolulu. Alright, here's Honolulu's approach. It has their weather planning minimums at 200.5. So we do the same thing. 200.5. We can reduce the visibility by half, no less than a quarter. That'll be 200.25. We will add 401 above our weather planning minimums. That'll give us 601.25. So that's what would need to be on our brief sheet, our -1 for weather, to know if we're going to meet that requirement. Our weather has to be 601.25 at H&L to know if we could utilize this airfield without needing an alternate. If it's less than 601.25 at the airfield at the time we're being flown, the approach is being flown, then we're going to need an alternate. But if it's at least 601.25 or greater, then we do not. So what if there's a NOTAM at Honolulu? Mauser's in op. Mauser's supposed to work, but the NOTAMs say that the Mauser's in op. We have our weather planning minimum that's designed for the lights to work like they're supposed to. Mauser's in op. Lights aren't working as they're supposed to, therefore visibility. Light's not going to reach us, and we won't have any type of identification with the landing, with the runway at the landing area. That's going to change our weather planning minimums because of that. Now we're going to have to increase our visibility since the lights decrease our ability to see the runway. So we increase our visibility by going to our INOPS component chart in the front of your approach. This is your INOPS component chart. It's in the front of all your instrument approach plates. If you look, we're doing the ILS there in the Honolulu. ILS, normal ILS, INOPS component Mauser for all the categories Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta. Says increase visibility by a quarter mile. Alright, so we'll do that. 95.1 says that we'll reduce our visibility by half after all corrections have been made. That's talking about components, charts, remote altimeter settings, things like that. So we take our 200.5 weather planning minimums. We'll add our quarter mile increase in visibility to our weather planning minimum. That gives us 200.75. We got to take that 3/4. Now that all the corrections have been made, we're going to reduce it for Category A approach. We're going to reduce it by half, no less than a quarter, and that gives us 3/8 of a mile. So now we're working with 200 and 3/8, and then we're going to add our 401 above that. So now our weather sheet, if we're going to land in Honolulu, our -1 says Honolulu has to be at least 600 foot, 1 3/8 or better to know that we don't need an alternate. If it was less than that, that's going to require us to have an alternate. Now we know how 401 above weather planning minimum is applied to know if we're going to need an alternate. Next, we're going to have the VFR caveat rule, meaning that if it's a clear day out there and I want to go and do an instrument approach just for training, radar would be required for the approach, or if nav aids were not monitored, but I still want to do it and weather's good, I should still be able to go out there. I'm not at risk for not breaking out. It's a clear day. Clear enough VFR to do this approach. So let's say the caveat rule then. They put the caveat rule in here so that way you can still do it. If any of these don't meet the requirement, you don't want to have an alternate. The VFR, if I could descend from en route minimum altitude for the approach being flown, if you descend from en route minimum altitude under VFR conditions, then you could continue to do the approach and not have to worry about an alternate. Even if radar is required for the approach you're trying to do, or if the nav aids you're using for the approach are not monitored, you can still do it without needing an alternate because you have the VFR caveat rule. It is a caveat to the first three. How do we apply the VFR caveat? Others call it the VFR kicker. So our en route altitude is going to be 5,000 foot. That's what it says on this approach here on the approach plate, and that's what I filed on my 175, which is what is important because that's my en route altitude, not what's on my approach plate. So I take my en route altitude, 5,000 feet, and in order to maintain VFR for Wheeler, it's a Delta airspace, class Delta, I'm going to have cloud clearance. Just because it's greater than 1,003 at the airfield, in order to fly a helicopter, I must remain VFR as well, meaning I have to maintain my cloud clearance. So I'll take the 5,000 foot, add 500 foot clearance to it for cloud clearance, so that's 5,500 feet. I'd subtract field elevation of 843. That'd give me 4,657 and 3 miles. So I need 4,657 feet and 3 miles in order to maintain VFR. Now, why did I subtract field elevation? Because the weather sheet I'm going to look at to determine that I'm VFR, remaining VFR for this approach from en route altitude to the approach being flown, the -1 weather sheet that I'm getting, they're going to report my altitude or the cloud's altitude in AGL. So I've taken MSL altitude, subtracted field elevation, so I know what that altitude is in AGL. So that gave me 4,657 feet and 3 miles. So my weather sheet's going to have to say greater than or equal to 4,657 feet and 3 miles. Of course, they're not going to report in increments of 57 feet. So you'd have to go with 4,700 feet. So this is how I did my math again. To go over it, I took my en route altitude, added my 500 foot cloud clearance, and it gave me 5,500. Then I need to subtract my field elevation because weather is reported in AGL at the airfield I'm flying to. That gave me 4,657. So I need 4,657 feet or greater and 3 miles in order to shoot this approach with the VFR caveat rule. Again, weather's not going to report 4,657, so you're going to have to round up. You do that at the very end if you're going to do it. Nowhere does it say to do it, but you know what the weather, you know that the weather is not going to give you 4,657. They're going to give you 4,700 or increments of 100 feet. So we would need 4,700 feet and 3 miles on our weather sheet to know if we could do this with the caveat rule. Caveats there, again, in case radar is required for the approach, but weather's still good, or nav aids are monitored and weather's still good to do this VFR. That's airfield selection. Now you go through the selection process to identify if an airfield can be used as an alternate. So if it didn't meet the VFR caveat rule or the radar required unmonitored and 401 predominant weather requirements, then you're going to need an alternate. Now we need to know how to select an airfield as an alternate. So we go through utilizing some of the same requirements. Radar can't be required for an alternate airfield for the approach to be flown. Navigates have to be monitored at the time the approach is being flown. You cannot have alternate not authorized for that airfield. You need 401 above weather planning minimums for the worst case conditions they're expecting, since this is going to be your last ditch effort at an airfield. You're going to have to plan for the worst weather on this one. 401 above worst weather planning minimum, 401 above the weather planning minimum. And this is going to be applied to the worst condition on your dash 1 on your weather sheet. VFR kicker rule, or again, the caveat. I put it in the middle, but it really belongs either top or bottom because it is separate from the other requirements. And then you got surface-based airspace at the time the approach is being flown. It needs to be Bravo, Charlie, Delta, or surface-based Echo. Needs to be in effect at the time the approach is being flown. It's important to distinguish that the Echo must be surface-based and it must be in effect at the time it's being flown, because some airfields close and their airspace doesn't go to the surface, it'll turn into a Class G. And then GPS can't be required for the approach. That's how you know if you need an alternate.